All right, and welcome back to another episode of Dr. Schwartz and Mr. Power. I'm your host, Mr. Power. As usual, I'm joined by my colleague and friend, the man who's crazy about eccentric training, Dr. Alex Schwartz. What's up,
Not much. I'm
Schwartz?
feeling very eccentric today.
Awesome. All right, so yeah, today we'll be discussing accentuated eccentric overload training, or for those with a long memory or who are old, negatives. For those who don't know, eccentric muscle actions refer to when a muscle lengthens under tension. For example, the lowering portion of most exercises, but more generally, eccentric muscle action is important in the daily activities, such as walking or putting a pen on a table. It allows you to control the lowering of limbs and plays an important role in absorbing shocks and energy. For example, when your foot hits the ground when you're taking a step, the energy is absorbed by eccentric muscle action in the leg. This allows you to move in a smooth, controlled manner instead of a jerky, erratic gait. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everybody to like, subscribe, give thumbs up or 5 stars or whatever it is. On YouTube, we're Praxis Strength and Nutrition. On all the podcasting platforms, this is Dr. Schwartz and Mr. Power. You can also check out our website, praxispn.com. We do consulting, we do coaching, we do all the cool things. We're also coming out with some new products soon, like standard or template programs, so keep an eye out for that. With that out of the way, our self-promotion, not shameless. Okay, so we'll discuss what accentuated eccentric overloading training is, or overload training is, why you might or might not want to incorporate it into your program, as well as some practical advice on programming it. All right, so why don't we just get down to it? Schwartz, why don't you take it away?
So first, a bit of nomenclature. Eccentric muscle actions when a muscle generates tension while it's lengthening. Even though the muscle is getting longer, it's actively producing force. It's not slack or passively stretched. And the term itself was coined in 1952 by Erling Asmussen. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He originally...
I think it's Asmussen,
but it's one S.
Yeah. I have no idea.
I think it's Asmussen. That sounds correct. So I'm going to go with that.
It does. More dignified.
It does sound dignified. More so than ass, yes. He originally used the word eccentric, like my dad used to say espresso instead of espresso. But eccentric later became the standard term. Now both refer to the movement away from the center. So that's how you got to think about it. You can think of an eccentric action as resisting a force or a weight while still yielding to it. Intuitively, this is something humans likely recognized thousands of years ago. So I guess the question is, why is it interesting and why does it matter for training program design for strength and hypertrophy? Now, eccentric muscle action has several unique characteristics, which is why we're talking about this podcast today. We're talking about it in this podcast today. And these suggest that there may be specific benefits to deliberately emphasize it in training. Do you want to, Mr. Power?
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, so eccentric muscle action. So we don't say contraction. Sometimes people say that, but contraction means to, towards the center, shortening. Eccentric action. So one of the unique attributes is you can develop significantly more force eccentrically than concentrically. So when you're pulling, you can't generate nearly as much force. An often quoted number or range is 120 to 130% more force can be developed than comparable concentric action or contraction. But I've heard numbers quoted as high as 140%. And obviously, as with any physical attribute, it's going to vary. Some people will be able to develop more, some less. But this was actually first described in 1882 by a German physiologist named Adolf Eugene Fick. So this isn't new, right? Like this has been around a while, or it's been recognized for a while, and it's been understood to be an intrinsic property of muscle action since, the late 19th century. Then about 50 years after that, Archibald Vivian Hill, who was, I guess, the creator, the inventor of biophysics, discovered that eccentric muscle action uses less energy, so fewer calories per unit force produced during concentric contractions. So that means essentially if you imagine a biceps curl and you curl 20 pounds and then you lower 20 pounds, you do it all at the same speed, it takes fewer calories to lower it than to lift it. So that's pretty interesting. So Hale himself, super nerd, went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for his work on muscle physiology. Like I said, basically invented the field of biophysics. And if anyone, and I recognize the name, and it turned out to be the same guy, I didn't know this before, but if anyone ever took biochemistry, the Hill equations, which describe enzyme kinetics, yeah, they're called the Hill equations because of him. So super smart guy. Still, in 2026, people are still using his equations and still using his models of enzyme kinetics.
I remember when we
were
talking about this in biomechanics class in undergrad, our prof would tell us that he jokes around with the physiology profs about how they always have an argument over whether you're actually doing any work walking downstairs. Whereas like a biomechanics prof would say, no, you're not doing any work. And a physiology prof would say, that's stupid. Of course you're doing work. So yeah. Well,
wow. We're arguing over definitions of work, right? Whether it's the displacement or whether we're talking about area under the curve for a muscle action, which I don't know, maybe we'll do a biomechanics episode one day. But that's a biomechanist messing with.
Yeah. He was a funny weird guy. I liked him. Yeah.
Universities are full of such types.
Breeding ground for it.
Other interesting things about eccentric muscle action. So they've been credited with driving a higher proportion of muscle hypertrophy, or muscle growth. So, for example, if you have two groups of people, two hypothetical groups, and they did the same exercise with the same loading, and one did just the concentric, so the muscle shortening component, and the other group did just the eccentric, you would expect greater hypertrophy in the eccentric only group. Why you do that, I don't know, but it's interesting from a mechanistic perspective in terms of our understanding of what drives muscle hypertrophy. And then the last thing, or one of the other things, and you'll hear this a lot too, or probably a lot of our listeners have heard this before, are aware of this, but it seems to be the main driver. It seems to be when most muscle damage induced by exercise occurs. So during the eccentric phase. So even though, the model of muscle damage being a requisite for hypertrophy has been pretty much abandoned, like it's not requisite, it can certainly be a trigger for muscle hypertrophy, or it's thought that can be the case, but you don't need it. Still, it's interesting. And, you can still see this in research on muscle damage because most of it is done by inducing muscle damage through really painful sounding eccentric regimes. So people, running downhill with weighted vests, or like on a negative slope with, on a treadmill, or they have these bicycles that, it's like a bicycle, like a stationary bicycle, but it pedals you backwards. Like it's got a motor, it drives the pedals backwards, and you have to resist it. And it's apparently just exhausting and causes massive amounts of muscle damage.
I mean, I'm thinking about what, just what you were just saying with if you compare two people who or two groups that are training concentric only, eccentric only, doing an hour of eccentric only training sounds horrible. Just absolutely horrible.
That would be, it sounds exhausting. Assuming, you're
just getting dumped basically for an hour by weights.
Although in the example I gave, we're assuming that you could also concentrically do it. So you're only doing the one. It wouldn't be any harder. It would be easier, I guess, because it would use fewer calories.
Just imagining loading up bars with way too much weight, just getting stapled underneath them. Yeah, just for an hour. Yeah, it just sounds pretty bad. Well, okay, so all of this has led to varying degrees of interest, obviously over the years, including mine of just getting stapled for an hour. But interest over training that just accentuates this eccentric portion of the exercise. The thinking's mostly revolved around using centric emphasis to drive greater strength gains, as you've alluded to, Alex. But I don't actually see this as the main thing they have to offer. But we will get back to that. Methods for incorporating accentuated eccentrics range from very straightforward to rather complex and pretty confusing. We'll talk about these. And so these are some of the misunderstandings about what does and doesn't constitute accentuated eccentrics.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, so before we get into that, why don't we talk a little bit about, because I think it's worth discussing, why are you stronger on the eccentric and why does it cost less energy? And this is important because it figures into, our understanding of whether, or I think it does, whether it's better suited for, say hypertrophy versus, training strictly for strength, because there's been, trends in the coaching community as to, what's the best application for this. And like everybody, I've got my opinions on it. We've developed opinions on this. And, I don't think it's, categorical. Like it's not that like one's totally right and one's totally wrong, but I do think that there's a better and worse applications for this, or more and less productive applications, and we'll get into that. So as to why, so the current thinking is that the protein titin, and so this is Titin, sorry, not like Titan, like Titan, although it comes from that, and it's not clear to me why they spell it the way they do, because this is actually the biggest protein that's ever been identified, and so it does mean Titan, as in huge, because it's this incredibly large, as proteins go. It's the most abundant protein in your muscle after actin and myosin, which I think most people are familiar with as the muscles that actually perform the active contraction or shortening of muscles. So titin does a few things, and one of these things is that it can generate tension passively. Whereas actin and myosin, the myosin heavy chain, which is this, protein that acts sort of like a paddle, or I imagine it as a paddle, and it grabs onto the actin and it pulls and it shortens the muscle. Titin will bind, but it doesn't, it's like it's strapping the muscle down, or it acts as like a, like a moor. And so when you're undergoing tension and active, or like when you're doing an eccentric muscle action. So, your muscle's in a shortened position and you're trying to resist lengthening it. Titin ends up connecting to the actin, I believe. Yes. And then it resists being stretched. And so it's like just stapled on through calcium binding, and it doesn't take any energy to do this. And so when you're undergoing an eccentric action, you have, the actin and myosin, and they're actively trying to shorten, and they can't because it's being overcome, or you've decided to not pull that hard. But then you still have this strapping system inside the muscle that both uses no energy, but also adds increased tension. And this is the current going explanation for why you can generate more force with fewer calories. Anyways, that's pretty interesting. And so it's sort of like the machinery within the muscle are tied down. And as you overcome this, you get snapping of the titin, or pulling away from the binding site. And, molecular research on this, you do actually see breakage of the titin molecule. And it's thought that some of the increase in stiffness and elasticity that comes along with training has to do with, remodeling of these titin proteins. All right, so that brings us, so why emphasize eccentrics in exercise? So the thinking is that it might result in greater strength gains, right? Although I think the results in the research and in my own experience, because I've tried the various versions of this over the years, it's a bit disappointing. And so the idea is that if you're able to handle more weight on the eccentric, if you train more weight eccentrically, you'll get stronger on the concentric component. But when we look at our current understanding of how this works, it's unlikely that that's really the case. There might be an increase in, the ability to store and return elastic energy. So if you look at, like you think of the bounce at the bottom of an exercise or the bottom of a jump, we can improve force that way.
The stretch shortening cycle
does store elastic. Yeah, and so the stretch shortening cycle is this reflex arc that causes greater muscle excitation on the concentric, but there's also a stored elastic component, and that seems to be mostly stored up in titin.
So I had a question about that. Is that related in any way to the Golgi tendon organ? Because that would inhibit that the idea of training, doing like plyo training or anything like that, getting that elastic energy is to inhibit that GTO, from what I can vaguely remember. So
okay, so for the listener, what Dr. Schwartz is asking about here is there's this, it's a cell with it's a little thing, we're not going to get into it, a little thing inside the cell called the Golgi tendon organ. And it's thought to act as a bit of a pressure gauge. And if you go over its threshold, it tells the muscle, it inhibits the muscle, says sort of shut off, your tension levels are getting too high, we're going to get hurt. And so something that you see in, plyometric training or even just regular strength training is an inhibition of this inhibition. So essentially taking off the brakes. So as you get stronger and you get more, accustomed and even able to deal with higher levels of tension, you see less activity and exercise from the Golgi tendon apparatus. I don't know that this is related to that. I don't want to say something stupid, but I think Titan would be, apart from that. So Titan's role is to, store elastic energy for recoil after, a stretch. So if, you think of, if you lower the weight quickly, or if you go down to a squat quickly and that bounce out of the bottom, a lot of that energy is coming from Titan. Or if, you dip down in a jump, like you go down and you jump up, that springiness as opposed to just jumping from a seated position. Again, the energy there is stored up in Titan. But yeah, the Golgi tendon organ sort of that's more of a neural feedback mechanism saying, okay, let's put on the brakes here. We're going to tear something. All right. So another reason you might want to train eccentric training, or another reason that people promote it or advocate, is that it might improve impulse, or like we were just talking about, the ability to come back with, or to apply that stored elastic energy more efficiently, right? So if you can, you do lots of eccentric overload, then, you get more, adaptation in terms of, I guess, remodeling of Titan. And then, you're able to recoil from, or, store and use this elastic energy more efficiently. And when you look at, so one of the ways to look at this is if you have eccentric overload, so you have some scenario where you're applying more weight on the eccentric than on the concentric, the velocity of the concentric tends to be higher, right? So if I've got a situation where I've got a weight that's heavier on the eccentric and I'm using something like weight releasers, and the weight comes off at the bottom of the eccentric, the concentric portion tends to occur at a higher velocity, right? And so this suggests that that this is a trainable property, and then it'll improve over time. So other than, a bit of remodeling of Titan, it's not clear to me that this would translate. And I don't see like really convincing evidence in the research yet, and, might prove to be the case, that this is, a training effect that carries over into situations where you don't have eccentric overload. So by which I mean, yes, if we apply a heavy eccentric load and we release it, people spring back faster, or, they come up faster. It's not clear that, when you don't use eccentric overload, you come up faster after training that way for a while, right? Especially once you normalize for any improvement in strength, right? So if we're just talking, you get stronger and you come up faster, well, that's always true if you get stronger. So is that, specific to, accentuated eccentric training or not? And it's not clear to me that it is.
How do you separate the two?
We talked a little. Yeah, well, I mean, you would have to do an experiment where you say, given, if you took two groups that had comparable increases in strength, one achieved through accentuated eccentric training and one through just, training for strength in some more traditional fashion, like traditional matched concentric eccentric load, would there be a difference in the unloaded condition that you're able to measure? And to my knowledge, no one's done that. I mean, I'm not like an expert in the research on that. So if that is the case, I'd be happy to see it. And then like the final reason, and I think for me, this is the most compelling. So the final reason for using accentuated eccentrics, I don't know, did we explain what they were? So basically you're applying more load on the eccentric than the concentric.
Yeah,
surely we said that.
I roll the tape back.
Yeah. So when we talk about accentuated eccentric, we mean, putting more load on the eccentric, not just like doing the eccentric more slowly, but through some tool or a partner or whatever. And we'll go into that. You have more load on the eccentric than the concentric. So to me, the most compelling reason to do this is for hypertrophy or for muscle growth. And I don't know, but I'm not really surprised at this when you consider what's happening. So that we know that long-term, muscle strength is closely related to hypertrophy. There's probably one of the single biggest long-term considerations or factors influencing hypertrophy. So I suspect that a lot of, the strength increases we see in accentuated eccentric overload training, or I'm just going to say AEL, in the research is actually probably attributable to what you see with hypertrophy. And so I think, something I've actually noticed in a lot of the research on AEL, not all of it, is that there's not a lot of discussion on normalizing the increased load. So, you have this research where they say Accentuated Eccentric Overload causes improvements in strength. And it's like, well, yeah, you're lifting more weight, not through the whole, the whole exercise, but for at least part of it, you're lifting more. And we know that, exposure to load is, again, one of the biggest short-term influences on increases in strength. So, it's not shocking that that's the case. But there was a recent paper published in the NSCA Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, and that was in December, and it was titled "The Effects of Accentuated Eccentric Loading, Repetition Structure on Muscle Strength and Adaptation." And that was by you and colleagues of the University of Beijing Sports University, as well as the University of Urbana-Champaign, which I guess is probably
Champaign in Illinois.
Champaign in Illinois. So yeah, it's not in Champaign, France. It is in Champaign, Illinois. Those are my two affected accents.
Managed to offend very different regions of the world in one go.
Yeah, that's fine. They all know it's all in good. It's fun. We're having fun. Okay, so what did they do? I thought this was interesting because they measured a few things. We're going to focus in on not all of it because otherwise, to properly review a paper would really take a whole episode, and I just don't want to do that. So they had an 8-week intervention with 39 male participants. They started with 41, but you always lose a few in these things. They split them into 3 groups, and each group worked out or did their workout or their program twice per week. And the 3 groups did as following. So the first group did 4 sets of 6 repetitions of back squats at 75% of their 1 rep maximum. And that was the traditional set. 75% of the weight squatted up and down for 6 reps. No accentuated loading, no fancy anything. Second group, they did, again, 4 sets of 6 repetitions at 75% of bar weight. And then they added weight releasers. So again, these are little doodads. It's like a hook, and it hooks on top of the bar. And when it hits the ground, and when you get to the bottom of the range of motion, the weights fall off. So they added weight on the weight releasers equivalent to 125% total. So the bar weight plus the weight releasers equaled 125% of their 1 repetition maximum. So they would go down with 125%, and you come up with 75%. So they added these on the 1st and the 4th repetition. Not sure why they chose that. It's probably based. Well, I think it's probably based on research around, or previous research around, what do you call it, potentiation effect, where, if you add this weight and you take it off, people are momentarily stronger. Right. I'm just guessing. I don't remember if they actually.
Could also just have been impractical to do 1 rep after the other or something. So they had to wait a couple. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Although the third group took, again, 4 sets of 6 reps. Each rep. The bar weight was 75% of their 1 rep maximum, but they added the weight releasers on each repetition. So you do the negative with the 125% of your 1 rep max squat. Weight falls off. You stand up with 75%. You have a couple people on either side, and we've done this. We do this with the weightlifting club. You add the weight back on. They do it again. You add the weight back on. Do it again. And we'll discuss this later, but one of the things about this is you need competent partners. Right? So the results. There's a bunch of results, but the thing that I want to focus in on was that the greatest strength improvements were there weren't actually a lot of differences except in the group where they did all 6 repetitions with the weight releasers. The strength improvements between the 6 repetitions or the 4 sets of 6 with the traditional weight, and where they had 2 sets that had the weight releasers were the same. You saw slightly different or slightly better improvement in some jump metrics in the 2 repetition group, like the 2 weight releaser repetitions, but they weren't a lot to write home about. But you did see differences in strength in the 6 repetitions with the weight releaser group, as well as improved jump metrics or jump characteristics, which I'm not going to get into. But what you did see was an increase in hypertrophy and a dose response relation, the follow dose response curve for the number of repetitions where they had the weight releasers. So the group with the smallest hypertrophy effect was the 4 sets of 6 repetitions. But then, it's a bit more hypertrophy with the group that had the 2 sets or the 2 repetitions per set with the weight releases. And then the greatest effect was seen where they had weight releases on all 6 repetitions. And So this to me actually makes a lot of sense, because what we're seeing here is, an increase in tension, which we know, the mechanical tension within the muscle is thought to be the mechanistic driver of hypertrophy, or it's, the best candidate for the biggest effect. And that's what you're doing with this, right? You're applying more tension for more reps, greater workload or greater volume load, however you want to discuss it. So yeah, anyway, so that to me, it's what I like about that is it squares mechanistically, and I think is a really good result. And it's one of the first studies where I've seen where they've done that, and I actually thought it was a pretty good study.
I think for me, one of the neat things that you could do to follow up something like this is to see whether it's an effect of, the actual eccentric training or just an effect of the increase in volume load, is doing the comparing how the opposite would happen. So you do 4 sets of 6 where you actually increase the concentric only weight and then match the total volume load of those sets. So I don't know, like with chains or something, although chains is kind of difficult because the weight's increasing slowly. So I don't know how you'd calculate the volume load.
Yeah.
But do you know what I mean? So you would sort of do the opposite. And what would happen? Would we see similar effects of hypertrophy? Would there be less? Then we could say that maybe there is something else on top of the fact that it's just volume load, or is it just volume load?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. I think the way I would do that is, well, you would have to find a way to normalize volume load, which I've been kind of messing around with. I'm not going to pretend like I've got a real lab to do this, but we can discuss it a bit maybe towards the end. Are you seeing a similar effect in terms of hypertrophy that you would see with just an equivalent volume load? And I sort of suspect that is the case, but I still think there's some advantage to doing it through the accentuated eccentric loading, which we can talk about at the end. But I think yes to both. Yeah, I think you could. But the challenge is it's sometimes hard to just get more volume load, right? Like if you're saying, okay, we'll just squat more.
If I could, I would. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And so I think in a way, the eccentric loading is a bit of a cheat on that, or it gives you a way around it. All right, so how do we apply this, right? So this is talked a bit about what it is, from a biomechanics and a physiological perspective. Talked a little bit about the research, and not in like huge depth, but just sort of saying this is some of the things people are looking at. So why don't you talk us through some of the methods people can actually use, like practically?
One of the things I think about immediately is just thinking old school bodybuilding. So just using that body English, that you have the two schools of thought, where one is like everything has to be strict and perfect form, and then the other school is using body English, like it's all in the hips. So using your hips to start a curl, or push pressing to strict press, Penley rows. It's sort of like the idea of cheating on purpose, but it's controlled cheating. I don't know if it kind of ties in again to our idea of the enhanced games here, but this is a different kind of controlled cheating.
Like cheating on purpose.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we should just. I would honestly rather watch people doing a bunch of wonky curls. I think that would be more interesting.
Well, I think that's, people don't necessarily think of that as a. I think it's like you said, it's always viewed as cheating, right? Like if you're doing a curl again, and you imagine thrusting it with your hip a bit, which I think most people are guilty of when they get tired, or sort of leaning back with your shoulders to get it up, and then you control the descent. So really what you're doing here is saying, okay, this is more than I can, it's now more than I can curl. But if I use other muscles to get it up, I can still get some, arguably accentuated eccentrics.
But and they're called cheat curls. It's deliberate cheat curls. Like we call them, cheat reps. And that's one, honestly, one of the most common ways I've seen this applied, and one of the first ways I've applied it myself. And I'm sure most people who start weight training, it's sort of the same idea.
When you start calling it accentuated eccentrics, you lend credibility to something that people argue over whether or not it's cheating. And I guess to me, the distinction is, is it on purpose? Like, did you set out to do this with a plan? And I think that changes the context versus I just want to lift this weight, and I don't care. I don't want to be seen lifting this weight, and I don't care what it looks like when I do it.
That's fair.
All right, so go on. Sorry.
Well, now, so we get into more sort of the advanced stuff that you come across. Like, this is almost like going through training age for me, but doing negatives with a rack or something similar. So you unrack a super maximal weight, You lower it under control into a rack, you get up, unload the bar, and re-rack the weight. It's doable, but it is super annoying. It's time consuming, and it also turns anything beyond a single rep into a cluster set, basically. If if you've done this, I've done this before, and I've done it a few times, then I just stop because I have better things to do with my life. I feel like half the time. It's a
Yeah, I've done this for sure. Like,
no,
sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah, so I've done this for sure. And I mean, I think, especially funnily, sort of earlier in my training career, if you can call it that. And I remember doing this, it would have been like the 90s. And yeah, first having access to like a power rack where I think it was a bench press program out of like Muscle Media
Sounds about
magazine.
right. Yeah.
And towards the end, it's like, add 50 pounds to your bench, one of these things, right?
Immediately put 50 pounds on and just drop it on you.
Like, there, you benched it. But towards the end, part of it was doing these negatives, right? And so, yeah, I'd put on whatever it was, 120% of my bench max. And, you try to fight it in the way down and control it as much as you can. And yeah, I remember that. That's certainly, and yeah, it's a nuisance because now, I mean, we already know this is a weight you can't lift. So now you're getting out from under it, and you're unloading weight, and you're re-racking it, and it's, you're a pain in the ass at the gym because it takes forever to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's another one that's a little more fun if you have a buddy, partner assisted. There's actually a few ways to do this. What the typical way is you lower the weight, they help you get it back up. I've done it the other way as well, where you get the weight up and then they put like on a bench press, they'll start pushing down on it. So that's obviously there's no way to kind of control how hard they're pushing down on it, but that's again sort of the same principle. So it's easier or harder depending on the exercise, and it's simple enough for something like bicep curls. Even bench press is one that's typically done, but it can get kind of sketchy for something like squats, and I guess bench too, because you don't really want to drop the bench on your on your chest or anything like that. And if your partner's not very strong, that might not be helpful. I don't know. It's sort of a side here, Alex. I don't know if you remember a long time ago, we were at the gym, myself, you, and Michelle, and we were watching those three guys. Yeah, those three guys who were basically lifting the weight for the guy in the bench press. Like this guy went on the bench, and there was no way he was putting up 315 pounds. Like, it was 3 plates, and we've been surprised before by people, but like you kind of, there's degrees to it, and then when they get out of like any kind of norm,
the surprise,
then there's surprise, right? Yeah. So we saw like, there's no way this is happening, and the guy goes under, and these 3 guys are really working hard because they also are not the biggest, strongest people either, and they're working together as a team to lift 315. It was like a 4-person lift, but I'm not sure if the guy on the bench was actually doing any lifting. But it's just like, I always think of that when I think of like the partner assisted ones with benching. So, and again,
yeah, I think use your head, right? Like, I don't think,
I mean, you shouldn't be doing it outside of a power rack, period. Like we saw this on like a regular bench press, which I think is a terrible idea. And as well, they probably had clips on, which is also not a great idea in those kinds of situations, because then it becomes a nightmare. With at least without clips, you can have an escape plan if you can tilt sideways. Again, this is nothing that we'd ever recommend,
unless the weight starts moving.
Yeah, it's a whole other problem.
I mean, just don't do this outside of a rack. Like, if you don't have a catch, whether it's straps or like pins, or like, just don't do this. It is just, you're just asking for trouble, right? People die bench pressing. That's a real thing. Don't be one of those people. I think so. Going back to what you're saying about whether having someone push down or if you should lower and have them help you lift it, I tend to side on I don't love the pushing down for like bench or squat. With squat, I don't even know how to do it.
Squat, I wouldn't even bother, no.
But bench, even pushing down, like you're going to add directionality to the bar that maybe you shouldn't be, right? Like your ability to push straight down with gravity is limited at best. But if you have someone who's taking a little more than they can bench, or maybe they're taking their 1 rep max from multiple reps and you're helping them get it up, it's at least a little less sketchy. Still, use a power rack. Oh my gosh. And if you're doing it with squats, this is something that should be done with someone on either side of the bar in a rack, not someone behind you, giving you the bear hug together, but rather 2 people on either side. And And there should be people you practice this with. This isn't like a one-off, call some guy over, two guys at the gym over to like, hey, okay, here's what I'm going to do. Super straightforward. I'm going to go lower the bar, but I'm going to definitely take all of it. And then you guys are going to help me pick it up. But, don't lift all of it. Still make me work.
Yeah.
Like, it's just, this is going to be a disaster.
It's got to be, there's got to be an understanding prior to that.
That's
the one thing I will say with
we use weight releasers, and
with the caveat that I had when I was doing the partner pushing was it was with just the bar. So it was progressively just getting, it was almost like a push up. Not that I'm defending it, because I was a teenager and it was stupid. And I think it was actually one of the coaches that was doing it. Yeah. Yeah, not one of the good coaches. Not naming names, but it was definitely not the good coach. But yeah, it was just with the bar, so it wasn't. Anyways, it was part of a lot of egregious things that I've done in my time in my old age of training.
Yeah. So another one, I think this one is because we've used these a fair bit, is the weight releasers. And so this is, people, if you've never seen these, just Google it, weight releasers. It's like a hook, and it drops off when they hit the floor. And you can set the height of them so that it drops off, when you want it to, typically in the bottom range of motion. And you can change the weight on them as well. So you can add plates to the weight releaser, so you can adjust depending on the person's strength level or what the objective that you're chasing, or how you've programmed these. And so these are the same thing that were used in the research that we just briefly discussed. And we use these, for instance, at the weightlifting club. Like, I have a set of these that we use. This is a bit like having a competent training partner, I guess, if you can think of that. Like, they put the right amount of weight on and they drop off when you want them to. Problem, or not the problem, but some of the limitations of them are, if you have to walk them out from a rack, they swing, and it's like a pendulum, and you have to wait for that to stop, like the oscillation to stop. And that's actually, if you're taking a heavy weight, that can be hard, because you're waiting 5-6 seconds for these damn things to stop swinging. So what we do is, typically you have 3 people. You have the lifter, and you have a person on each side, and the people on the side put the weight on once the person's in position, and then reapply the weight on subsequent repetitions. And so, sounds straightforward enough, and it is, but there's a bit of a learning curve on this too. So, you have to communicate with the partner across from you, like the other person putting the weight on, because if one puts it on at a different time than the other, you get this teeter-totter effect on the bar, and that's not great fun when you're the person under the bar. But with a bit of practice, it's navigable. But, it does take some practice. This is, the first time we did it, it was, at least 2 people fell over with the bar on their back. Yeah, it's a little sketchy the first time you do it. And so it takes practice, and, don't start with like the heaviest weight possible, but it's also harder with an empty bar because it moves around in a weird way. So there's definitely a learning curve. The other solution to this is a monolift. So for those who don't know what that is, it's like a device. You can get attachments for squat racks now that do this, but basically the weight's in the rack, and when you stand up with it, the rack moves, the hooks move out of the way, so you don't have to walk the weight out. And this can be really helpful for something like this, because you get out of that oscillation problem, but then you have to re-rack the weight every time and reattach the racks the hooks every time, or the weight releases every time. So it turns it into a cluster set, but you can do it by yourself or with, just one partner. And again, if you have the time and the space, and, if you're doing this in your garage or with a club that specializes in this, which you probably are, because you don't see weight releasers at regular commercial gyms, then it's doable. It'll add 5 minutes to your workout, but who cares?
Burn some extra calories.
Yeah. So I think and so, okay. Well, fine.
What about bands?
Okay, go ahead.
What about bands?
Okay. Actually, bands, that's a good question. You'll often see, we're talking about, again, for the uninitiated, when you're attaching bands to the bar to pull it down towards the floor, right? So it's like resistance through basically a giant elastic band. So some people say this is accentuated eccentric overload. In a way it is, because it does accelerate you towards the floor faster. People talk about it as like a weight of band, but it doesn't apply force by weight. So force is equal to mass times acceleration. So, you increase the force the bar is putting on you by adding mass, so weight, or you can increase acceleration, which is normally applied by gravity. If you add a band, this increases acceleration. So it's not actually like adding more weight. And that's why it feels a little bit different when you actually lift with bands, because it feels like it's pulling you down faster. And it is. However, the way I conceptualize accentuated eccentric overload is that you're doing more work on the eccentric than the concentric.
This is still a lot of work concentrically.
That's not the...
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually more work concentrically, which is we'll get to in a sec. So, and not everyone's going to agree with that, and that's fine. And they can be used to, you know, do more work on the eccentric than you would normally get just with gravity. But the thing I don't like about bands is that they're weakest when you want sort of the most, where it matters most, you know, like what we know now about long muscle lengths, and that this is really where most of, you know, a lot of the benefit anyway occurs at a long muscle length, but that's when bands are doing the least, when you're in the bottom. And the other thing, and this is getting a little pedantic here, but okay, bands are easier to, or it's harder work to stretch a band than it is for a band to pull you back. And so by which I mean they apply more force when being stretched than when they're pulling you, like than when you're yielding to them. And this actually goes into like the physics of how the elastic band works. So if it were a metal spring, it would be the same whether it's being stretched or whether it's pulling you back, because the spring gets its, you know, springiness from the bending of bonds between molecules, and that the force on that increases in a linear way, just because physics. In the case of elastic bands, so latex rubber or synthetic elastic material, is it's actually like the elasticity comes from these long sort of polymer-like molecules that are crimped up, and when you uncrimp them, that's where the stretch comes in, and that doesn't behave in a linear way, and so it doesn't apply the same force when it's contracting as when you're stretching it. And you can actually see this if you took a rubber band, this is like a sort of class of experiment, and you hung a weight from it, or you took a rubber band with no weight on it, you see the length of the band, and then if you hang a weight from it, it'll go down, I don't know, say 30 centimeters. And then if you carefully remove the weight, it doesn't come back to the same length. It ends up a little more stretched.
Yep.
Or up. If you took a portion of the weight off, it would do that. Anyway, it's sort of a weird effect, but probably doesn't actually matter that much, but it's interesting. But, you know, it's not a spring, it's a band. So I don't actually think they're really what most people are going for with accentuated eccentrics. They're not going to deliver most of what you're looking for. And I definitely don't think you're going to, because you can't, I guess, you know, disentangle the concentric from the eccentric with bands, that they have any special sort of hypertrophy benefit apart from, you know, you're doing more work overall. So, and then the last one, and we're not going to spend time on this because I sort of feel like this was a few things. One, I haven't actually used these in person, and this is flywheels. The other is that it's a little more complicated and probably deserves its own episode. But like I said, I want to have at least tried these to be able to speak to the feel of it. But this is interesting. So a flywheel is, as described, it's like a wheel, and it's attached to an axle. And then there's like a cable or a strap that's wrapped around the axle. So it's like a spinning top or a yo-yo, and you pull on the band or the strap, and it spins the wheel. And so spinning the wheel is what applies the resistance. It's, you pull hard, it's a heavy wheel, it gets spinning. And so just like a yo-yo, when you get to the end of the band or the end of the strap, the wheel keeps spinning and it starts winding the strap back the other way. And so you imagine a yo-yo going to the ground, keeps spinning, and it winds up the other direction. So the interesting thing about this is that there's like no coasting allowed, right? Like as soon as you hit the top, it's pulling you down very forcefully. Again, some people argue about whether or not this is really accentuated eccentric, because you can only get out of it what you put into it, but you also can't, I mean, actually, maybe you could coast on the way down, but it's sort of where a lot of the current research, there's a few groups looking at this, and it tends to produce, so far in the research, very robust increases in hypertrophy and strength, probably because it's hard to cheat, is my guess. Like you have to put in the eccentric work. You can't just sort of let gravity pull you down, or at least it's easier for people, I guess, to conceptually like push against this sort of winding resistance. Interestingly, the first place I ever heard of the flywheels, was actually in the context of a regenerative braking in vehicles, or as like a battery for storing energy. Like you get a wheel spinning And if it's on good bearings, it'll just keep spinning for quite a while and store that energy.
And somebody
That's
heard
neither here
that and
nor there.
thought, how could I get jacked off of something like that?
Yeah, how can I
Yeah.
use this to get big muscles? I guess, yeah. There's a company that is making versions of this that where it's coupled with a motor that ensures that the eccentric portion is actually applying more force than the concentric. But I can't remember the name of the brand, and it doesn't matter because there's only one company, and it's prohibitively expensive for all but the sort of most deep pocketed, or at least people who want to spend money on kooky things. The other thing about them, which again I just have to read more. I just don't feel comfortable
I'm
speaking
so
to it.
curious
Is
about this now.
the way you yeah, I'd be interested in getting one just to mess around with, not the motorized one, because I'm not spending, I don't know, like 20 grand on a
More
motorized
flywheel.
flywheel because it's neat. Yeah, like it's cool, but it's not
Yeah.
that cool. It's how do you quantify the load from these? And there are groups working on that, and it's interesting, but it's not, again, because there's this acceleration component, and yeah, the way they're quantifying that is interesting, but still being worked out. So I think we will revisit this in a different episode, but leave it for now. But it's cool and it's out there.
Well,
Oh, man.
there is one more that I think people would consider eccentric. It's jumps, just doing jumps. In the literature, you'll see things like doing a jump where you just hold on to weight and then release it, thereby you unload on the concentric. But really, kind of any depth jump would be considered an accentuated eccentric, especially if you don't actually do the jump part. If you just kind of drop.
So I just drop and
Yeah,
absorb the
yeah,
load,
exactly.
right? It's very old style
Yeah,
Soviet training, Verkhoshansky
yeah.
style stuff, where you just like has guys dropping off like 3 meter boxes and just like taking the
No,
hit.
you jump. You want me to jump down there? Yes, just jump down. Don't even worry about coming up.
Wrong
I
again.
probably won't come up.
Yeah. No, exactly. So I mean, but yeah, I mean that's another way for sure. That's something that's didn't have that name, but people have been doing for a long time.
Yeah, I've done some wacky stuff with hammer throwing too. Doing some wacky stuff again now too. Some of it can be pretty fun.
With your wacky old. How's the hammer throwing going? How's it feeling any more natural? I know for people who are just tuning in, you've former competitive hammer thrower in his 40s, re-embarking on some hammer throw to get back in shape. How's that going?
I love the feeling of it. So the first time I started actually being able to do turns, like consecutive turns, sets of 10 turns, it felt I felt like a new human again. It was really nice. I really missed doing it.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
fun.
So it was it's just so funny because I've been doing little things for training for it, just mimicking movements and doing a lot of like the strength components. But the moment I started turning with the hammer, it's just there was a bunch of muscles that I hadn't worked in a few years. I'm like, there it is. So it was
Nice.
it's
That's
really
awesome.
neat. It felt like really really nice. I haven't felt that nice after training in a while. So looking forward to slowly getting back and puttering my way into throwing in a cage again.
Nice. All right, so let's start sort of putting together this eccentric stuff into something people can use, or sort of tie this into a nice package with a bow on it, I guess. So why don't you just start us off on that?
Yeah, so I think that accentuated eccentrics aren't really the greatest for strength per se, or at least once you normalize for volume load, like we were talking about earlier. I just don't think there's anything unusual happening. Usually the effects attributed to this idea of nervous adaptation, and I think that nervous system effects are often what invoked when we're not sure what's happening. This idea of it. I think the actual adaptations of the nervous system are pretty minimal, and it's for especially for like simpler movements, and I think mostly tapped out pretty early in the training process. And the effects of strength on your 1 rep max super maximal eccentric loading in the literature are underwhelming, so to say the least.
Yeah, and that's a consistent result, especially with some of the newer research. As you get sort of more research accumulating on this, it's that there is you're lifting heavy weights, you get stronger, but it's comparable to what you would get just pushing heavy weight anyway. Again, especially when if you have even just sort of thinking in your head, okay, let's correct for this. Actually, they're lifting a little heavier. It's like, okay, yeah, there's an effect on strength. They're lifting heavy. That's what lifting heavy does. And then, yeah, and the nervous system stuff, I think it's often sort of hand wavy. And I think, a lot of the neural adaptations for simple movements, like you alluded to, they happen right away at the beginning. Like these are like, like rate coding or, increase in neural drive. Like that happens like pretty fast. And I think, this is something your body does because it's cheap and easy to do. It's easier to change rate coding of a neuron firing than it is to grow new muscle. So your body does it like right away, right? Like it takes essentially next to no energy. So, and I think your body really leans towards that parsimonious model of adapting to things. Similarly, I'm not super convinced or impressed with the, this potentiating effect. So this is something that's been, looked at a lot. So for those who don't know, this is the idea that if I lift something really heavy, and then a very short period after that, like in the same set, like I have a really heavy eccentric with a weight releaser for my first repetition, the subsequent repetitions, I'll be stronger. And there does seem to be an effect, but it's small. And so what you end up seeing is that, people are able to do the same number of repetitions, but they come out of the bottom a little faster. And I just not impressed with that. Again, sort of going back to what we were saying before, where it's like, is this just an effect that's going to, occur when I have this heavy eccentric load on the first rep? It's not strong enough to even get more repetitions out of. So the training load effect isn't going to be really substantial. Like, who cares if I can come up a little faster out of a few reps? I don't think there's a lot of evidence, and I'll, challenge the, velocity training folks on this one. I don't think the training effect is there. It's like an artifact of having the first weight be heavy. But unless you're competing in an event where the first weight is heavy and then you have to crank out 6 more of that thing, I just don't know. I'm unconvinced, I guess. That's the diplomatic way to put it. Like, I think the effect's real, but it's no more than, or in some, like, I don't think it's any more than you would get from doing a traditional like top set where you work up to a single heavy set and then, you do some back off sets to get your volume in. So I don't know. I'm not super compelled by that. I don't find it compelling. I think what I do find the most convincing and where I think the real application of this is with hypertrophy. Yeah. And I don't know that this is really the consensus opinion among coaches. And I'm just going to disagree with them. And I think what's happening here is, if we look at, mechanistically, what's driving hypertrophy, and it seems to be, that the consensus position is that it's largely, mechanical tension in the muscle. And so what we're getting with this accentuated eccentric overloading, especially for, like in the research we were discussing before, for a bunch of repetitions, 6, 8 repetitions, is we're getting a bunch of, additional tension, but we're getting it cheaply, right? We're getting it in a context where we're using less energy. And so we can do more of it. And if there is any sort of additional or additive effect to the heavy eccentric stuff, and it might be, it might not be, I don't know, we'll see. I think it's coming from the fact that this is a bit of a cheat where you can get more tension in the muscle without spending more energy. And that goes back to what you were asking before, because I have turned that over in my head. Like, could you just lift more? And it's like, yeah, except until you can't, right? Because you run out of gas. This is a way to do it where you're not running out of gas. Like I've had, this weekend we had people in the gym, like we have one of my groups, they're in a phase where they're doing this and they're doing, like similar to that research, you're doing 6 repetitions with the weight releases on. And, the eccentric load is 100% of the 1 repetition maximum. And they're coming up with about like 70% of the 1 repetition max. And it's hard to imagine another scenario where they're able to handle, 100% of the 1 rep max over and over and over. And they're tired after it, but they're not ruined. Like, it's hard work, but they're able to do it. And I think it's that you're sneaking in a low energy version or sneaking in low energy tension.
Well, I also
right?
think of the uses, and I'm pretty sure you've done this in the past, where you're working with people who are beginning training and who can't do pull-ups. You get them onto the bar, you help them up onto the bar, and then they slowly lower themselves, and you get reps in that way to at least even get used to being up in the bar and holding your weight down and controlling yourself.
Well, yeah, you get a bunch of you get a bunch of heavy negatives,
Yeah.
right? And again, I mean, when I first my first use of that, because I remember doing that with clients in like the early 2000s. My thinking at the time was like, this is a strength
Hmm.
thing, right? That this is, they're building strength through. I probably would have explained it with, some neurological explanation that I didn't understand at the time. But when I think of it now,
Building muscle.
I just think of it as like tons.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're building muscle, and it's a ton of extra
Hmm.
volume. Oh, we seem to have lost my video. I don't know if
No.
my camera battery might be dead. Let me check a wire, see if I'm unplugged. Yeah, I think my camera battery's dead. People have to go through this without seeing my.
That's a shame. Well, I hope
It is
they'll
a shame.
stick around anyways. Yeah, the
Yeah, we'll see.
highlight's gone, but I'll do my best.
All right, give me 1 second. I'm
There
back.
he is.
Change the
Yes.
battery. So yeah, I think it's further evidence of, or is evidence for this hypertrophy benefit, or that being like the big thing. I mean, one is the counter argument. That's that I just haven't seen great results trying to use this to directly do strength work like I have over the years. Tried a bunch of times doing like heavy eccentrics or weight releasers or these force reps, and they haven't played out well. But for the hypertrophy stuff, people seem to be getting results. And you look at if you point back to the flywheel stuff, which I promise you wouldn't really get into, that research tends to show quite robust hypertrophy results. And it's all higher rep work that they're doing. And part of that's just because it doesn't lend itself to one rep max work, right? Like this is something where you gotta pump in the work to the flywheel, right? Like it's based on your previous eccentric or concentric contraction, or your concentric muscle action. And so it takes a couple reps just to get this thing up to speed, right? Where it's spinning appropriately and you've got sort of like a rhythm to it. I mean, again, I haven't done this myself, but just from talking to people and reading the research. And I think that plus the research we covered earlier in the episode bolsters this, this explanation that's more hypertrophy driven.
I really want to use a flywheel now. You've really sold me.
Maybe I'll buy myself one.
Yeah,
for my birthday.
totes. We're just gonna be flywheel guys now. This is what's happening.
Yeah, the flywheel industrial complex bought us out. Big flywheel.
Flywheel. Harder or easier?
Yeah, it would be harder. Yeah, it would be a function of the mass of the flywheel and the distance from the center that it's rotating around.
Well, so not
which anyway, is part of what makes it.
I mean, neither of these examples require any sort of like hand wavy explanations, have you said, like neural adaptations. It is worth pointing out that most neural adaptations for simple movements occur very early and very quickly, as you've said. This makes sense when you think of the body as this parsimonious machine. It's always trying to find, as you said, the easiest, lowest energy ways to do things. And changing neuron firing rates or patterns takes very little amounts of energy compared to increasing muscle mass, which is very energy intensive by comparison. So just kind of summarizing what you were sort of talking about with this, and neither of these things requires that.
Yeah, no, and I got a bit ahead of myself on that, but because I knew that part was coming up, but I don't know. That happens. And yeah, I've been playing with different methods for trying to quantify volume load with weight releasers. I find some way to make it. And it's not just a mental exercise, right? Like you want some way to compare it to the training that you're doing before you incorporate it. Because, is it harder? Is it easier? And, so basically what I've done is I take the general approach, and I'm going to do a video on this actually outside of the podcast, and I'll post it on our YouTube channel, maybe write an article about it, post that on praxispm.com. So basically the considerations that I use to come up with this sort of quantification is that, you take the weight that you're doing, like the barbell weight or the bar weight, and then you consider, okay, I'm adding weight to that, but it's only on the eccentric component, so it's only for half the repetitions is one way to think of it. And then you apply to that the idea that you're only using some proportion, let's say 60% of the amount of calories to lower, and so you use that, I guess like knock the value down a little bit. And then you come up with a number that it spits out that you add on to the barbell weight. And it works okay. Like I'm not going to pretend it's bulletproof or super validated, but it has given me a way to sort of normalize a little bit the accentuated eccentric work by way of weight releasers to a normal barbell work, and it's actually it's comparable. It works okay, so I'll do a video on that because I think it's sort of an interesting exercise. So I guess finally, how do you program this stuff, right? Like, how do you, like, say you're like, all right, I'm going to buy weight releasers, or, I go to a specialized like powerlifting or weightlifting or strongman gym, and they've got this crap lying around. I've seen them. I don't know, what to do with them. So probably not a big surprise. We advocate using these primarily as, a driver of hypertrophy. I don't think you're going to go terribly wrong trying to use it for strength directly, but again, I just find the results underwhelming. So if you're doing this to support hypertrophy goals, then you would place it in your programming accordingly. So if you're a strength athlete or an athlete who's undertaking a period in your periodized plan where you want to do some hypertrophy, that's where this would fit in. I've been doing things not dissimilar to what they did in that research. So sets of 4 to 8 repetitions where the concentric portion isn't too light. So 70 to 80% of one repetition maximum. And then in that research, they went with 120% on the eccentric component. I found that like 100% is, especially for people new to using these, is more than enough for people to feel like they've done a lot. I think 120 is pretty aggressive. I'm not saying you can't do it, but maybe don't start at 120. 100% of your 1 rep maximum being the combined weight of the weight releaser and the barbell weight, and keep the barbell weight above 70%, right? And so a little bit of math on, that you're going to be burdened with doing, but we believe in you. And yeah, that's sort of where I've been starting, and like introducing it once a week on something like squat or bench press. It's got to be something where, there's an easy way for the bar to be released. It's not, I wouldn't bother with something like this on like a biceps curl. I mean, the weight releases themselves weigh like 10 kilograms each. So, and that's just the ones I have. Others are going to weigh different things, but it's not.
I want to see it on a bicep curl.
They're not, you can't just, you're not going to throw it on everything, right? So I've got my 20 kilograms of weight released on top
for
of
skull crushers.
Some people have very strong curls. Yeah, it would be. And yeah, the other thing is allow some time for learning. They're a little weird at first. It takes a little bit of getting used to 2-3 workouts to really get a good rhythm on them, and for your training partners to be really effective at loading them, unloading them. You're going to have some misfires. You're going to have some, sort of wonky loads. Don't worry about it. It's just all part of the learning process. The other thing you come across a lot in the literature on this, or especially if it's not the scientific literature, coaches or talk about how this is so taxing and it really hits your ability to recover. Like, I haven't found that at all. Like, it's hard for sure, but it's no harder than other hard workouts. Maybe a little more soreness on account of the eccentric component being responsible for muscle damage. But I also have noticed that, especially with the weight releasers, I've talked about how they act as a pendulum, they swing around. When they come off, it's not like super crisp or super clean break from the weight releases, right? Like there's a bit of jiggle. It throws your balance off a little bit. So what ends up happening is people exercise really strict form on the eccentric, especially in the bottom. You don't see people like dropping into the bottom and bouncing out. Instead, you see people like sort of carefully setting the weight down. And in the process, I think being a little stricter on form, especially in the lengthened position, spending a little more time in the bottom. And this is making it harder too. So basically it forces people to be a little more honest with the weight they should be using. And I think that's part of it as well. So yeah, people report a little more muscle soreness, like delayed onset muscle soreness or DOMS at the beginning, but not out of line with, when you introduce a new hard exercise or, if you undertake an increase in your volume. It's not crazy. And it doesn't seem to be impact recovery any more than any other hard workout. All right, so conclusion. Why don't you get started on that? We should probably let people get on with their whatever they do and they're not listening to us.
Well, everything old is new again, or maybe old things are just getting renovated. Accentuated eccentric overload may provide unique benefit, but when you account for the increase in volume load, it's not really clear that it just isn't a case of lifting more or having stronger training effect. What is interesting to me is that it allows you to deliver more mechanical tension to the muscle in a way that's less energy intensive. Accentuated eccentric overload training is fun. It's interesting. It's a way to shake it up. And we always encourage that here. And that can be very motivating for trainees. So again, we've said this in previous podcasts, but you really shouldn't underestimate the role of fun and novelty and motivation. And also just something new, like you said, to make you a little bit sore. I enjoy the feeling of soreness after a hard training session sometimes. Like sometimes it's nice knowing that, oh hey, I feel like I'm doing something new and it's stimulating, and this flight of stairs is going to be more challenging than usual. I've grown to enjoy that, and I think a lot of people who work out and exercise regularly sort of enjoy the feeling of soreness as well. Not obviously too much where it's,
Yeah.
you can't use the toilet
and not all the
comfortably.
time.
Yeah, not all the time.
Oh, man.
There also seems to be a team building aspect to it, which again think has real value. So don't underestimate it. And in general, I think I can speak for both of us here, Alex, in saying that we're pretty underwhelmed with the supposed strength effects attributed to this neural mechanism that we talk about. And we tend to think that the effect is primarily driven through volume load induced hypertrophy.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree because we confer on these things. We don't agree on everything, but this is, I think, one of the things we do agree on. Like you said, and we've said a few times, I think it's a nice way to get extra tension without tons of extra calories burned. Like, yeah, you could just lift more, but there's certain limit on that, both energy and time. Mm-hmm. I like your point about the team building and the fun. That's real. I see that when we do these, like when we first started introducing these people, I mean, it sounds bad, but people falling with the bar, right? Like everyone had a laugh and a couple people did it, and they all learned together and they became better at loading the weight for each other and communicating, and they feel like they're doing something together. And a lot of strength training tends to be really individual, and this is something that forces people to kind of work as a team, and it's fun. People enjoy it. Like I see that. I see people like, and it's a gadget, and gadgets are fun. If it did nothing other than motivate people, I would still be like, all right, this has some value. Like if it did no physiological underpinning, it was just fun, I'd still be like, yeah, give it a go.
This has been brought to you by Big Weight Releaser. Big flywheel and Big Weight Releaser. That's our show today.
Big flywheel. Hell yeah. I should have had more flywheel puns, but I dropped the ball.
Drop the wheel.
Does that count? I don't know. Yeah. I want to reinvent the wheel on puns. It's too late. I got nothing.
Yeah, it is late.
Okay. So that's it. That's what we got for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out our website, praxispn.com. There will be a bunch of show notes for this episode. A lot of citations that we just sort of glossed over, but I want people who are interested to be able to find them. Stuff on Accentuated Eccentric, weight releasers, and even some of the flywheel stuff, because it is interesting, but I think it's sufficiently different and complex to justify its own episode. And also, like I said, I want to actually get one of these and try it, because they do look super fun, and I'm old, and sometimes new fun things are justification enough in themselves. All right, so that's it for us. Have a great night, folks.